The title is Me, and these are stories of my life. And they're written by me, and I'm Katharine Hepburn, and I'm going to read this to you. I have a friend who keeps asking me why I've written this book, especially as I've said 1,000 times, me? No, that's personal. No, I'm not going to talk about that. What made me change my mind? I wonder myself. Something changed me. I think, I'm not saying I know, but I think that I've always thought of myself as an actor. Now in the last few years I've seen that creature whom I created sitting around. She's sitting around saying, "Hey, what goes on? What are we going to do? We're wasting time. Let's get going." "Shut up," I said. "I'm sick of you. I'm not going to hide behind you anymore. Who are you, anyway? You're not me. You're that great big beautiful doll. You're the lucky side of the coin. You were born at the right time. You looked right. You sounded right. You were lucky. You caught on. You got rich. Good. I'm glad you had a good time. Now, I'm going to take over." "What is that you're saying? Who am I?" "Well, I'm me. I'm what is called the power behind the throne. I am your character. Isn't that what they call it? Your do this, don't do that. I'm your fundamentals. I run your ship, you're the ship. You're getting a bit long in the tooth, and I may not be able to sell you as easily as I used to. You have a right foot which doesn't work all that well. I mean, it hurts. In 1982, you ran into that telephone pole. Dumb of you. Dumb. Listen, so it hurts, but at least they didn't have to cut it off. Yes, of course, it threw your whole balance off. Your body balance right off, and now your back is painful too. Gosh, what do you expect? You've just taken your body for granted. You're lucky you had a good one to begin with. Oh, yes, those 2 shoulder operations, rotator cuffs. Isn't that what they called? Yes, of course. Oh, yes, you're right. Hip is fake. When did that go bad? 1973. Oh, that was quite a while ago, wasn't it? Well, you're lucky. That operation really worked. Oh, hell, you're lucky. You can see, you can hear, you can bicycle, you can garden. Yes, kneeling down, but that's restful, isn't it? Kneeling down. Anyway, here's where I come in. I'm your character. I don't think that you've ever realized how handy I've been for you. I've been there. I tell you what that means. I'm your backup when you make a decision which is poor, and what you become involved in doesn't work. And here I am, trying to explain it away. You know what I really am? I'm my main gift from my parents. And when I realized this, I also knew why I had suddenly become interested in writing this book. I wanted to discover the real reason back of all the fluff, that bit of fiber which can be developed in all of us. There it is, it's waiting to be used. That is what suddenly struck me. How did I make it work? How did I have brains enough to survive that play, The Lake, and the early failure of my movie career, the box office poison period? And how did I develop such a handy head of common sense? That's what really keeps you afloat. You can say, you had enough money to swing it. Yes, I had, but money alone doesn't do it. I wasn't going to starve, but I could have been defeated. It's finding out where you went wrong and correcting it. For instance, in The Lake, I let Jed Harris, the producer, push me around. I knew that I was being pushed around, and I didn't talk back. I didn't say, look, I'm the one who has to sell this, and if you make me into a mush, I'll just be a mush. And I was a mush. The tale of The Lake and my survival was extremely important to me. I learned responsibility to say, talk to me, I'm to blame. And the movies, same sort of half-assed way. I let myself say, yes, okay, instead of, no, I don't like that script. I'm not going to do it. To learn responsibility. Each of us has to learn responsibility. Here we are. Live up to your potential. But what to do? Well, don't you see what I'm doing and why I'm doing it? I'm telling you my life story. I've been driven to it. What else can I do? So before you begin, I have to warn you that what follows does not follow a path. When I say story, I mean stories of my life. And when I say stories, I'm afraid I mean flashes. Before I tell you anything about myself, I would like to tell you, or at least identify for you, the world into which I was born. My background, I mean, of course, my mother, my father, my 2 parents. Mother died when I was 40-odd. Dad died when I was 50-odd. Thus, I had them as they were always there for 40 years. There. They were there, and they were mine. From where I stood, Dad at the left of the fireplace, Mother at the right of the fireplace, tea every day at 5. They were the world into which I was born, my background. My mother, Katharine Martha Houghton, was born February 2nd, 1878. She was the daughter of Caroline Garlinghouse and Alfred Augustus Houghton. Alfred Houghton was the younger brother of Amory Houghton, who was the head of the Corning Glass Company. It started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, moved to Brooklyn, and ended in Corning, New York. Alfred's first wife had died, leaving him a daughter, Mary. He then married Caroline Garlinghouse. They had 3 daughters, Katharine, Edith, and Marion. Alfred and his wife were happy. They were financially comfortable, not rich, not poor. He played the violin, she played the piano. They were interested in Robert Ingersoll, the great agnostic, and they went to all his lectures. They had abandoned the recognized church. Alfred was about 20 years older than Caroline. Apparently his relationship with his older brother Amory was complicated. Amory had fired him from the glassworks because he was always late. Then Alfred became the head of the Buffalo Scale Works. He was a moody sort of fellow by nature and a victim of severe depressions. During one of these episodes, he was visiting Amory in Corning, and he disappeared. He was found dead of a self-inflicted gun wound in the head on the railway tracks. No note, nothing, just dead. So my grandmother, Caroline, was left with 3 daughters to bring up. Then it was discovered that Caroline had cancer of the stomach. She knew that she was doomed to die in fairly short order. Caroline dreaded leaving her girls to be brought up by any of their available relatives whom she considered hopelessly reactionary. She wanted her daughters to go to college. She visited Bryn Mawr College with my mother, Katharine. She made arrangements for Mother to go there, and made arrangements for the other 2 daughters, Edith and Marion, to go to Miss Baldwin's boarding school, which was almost next door to the college. By the time her mother died, Katharine was 16, Edith 14, and Marion 12. Katharine was filled with her mother's feeling about the future. She wanted to go to college, to Bryn Mawr. She wanted to lead her younger sisters in the right direction, and she was not about to let Uncle Amory boss her around. Uncle Amory, by the same token, was used to having his own way. He thought the girls should be girls and should go to finishing schools and learn to be ladies. These girls wanted an education, to be independent. Everything seemed at a standoff. Then Mother realized that she was old enough to appoint her own guardian. Uncle Amory was the one who managed her money, but he was not her legal guardian. She threatened to appoint a man very unfriendly to Uncle Amory as their guardian, and forced his hand and got her way. She went to Bryn Mawr. The girls went to Baldwin, and later they both went to Bryn Mawr. When Caroline Garlinghouse died, she was 34 years old. She must have been a very strong character. My mother talked a lot about her beauty, her strength of character, her determination, that the daughters get an education and live lives independent of the very dominating Amory Houghton Corning Glass group. Her credo, go to college, get an education. I felt the enormous effect my grandmother must have had on my mother, who was the eldest of the 3 girls. So my mother was the one who received the powerful philosophy of George Bernard Shaw. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Don't give in. Fight for your future. Independence is the only solution. Women are as good as men. Onward. You don't have too much money, but you have independent spirits, knowledge, education. Make your own trail. Don't moan. Don't complain. Think positively. My dad, Dr. Thomas Norval Hepburn, he was born December 18th, 1879. He was a year younger than Mother. He was the son of Reverend Sewell Snowden Hepburn and Selina Lloyd Powell. He was the youngest of their children. Dad's mother was the member of a very important and distinguished Powell family. As with other families in the South, they had been quite impoverished by the Civil War. Dad really loved his mother. They were very close, and he developed a high regard for the female sex through her. She was his ideal, a fighter with the highest standards. She believed in education. Grandfather was a minister in the Episcopal Church, never made more than $600 a year. Dad went to Randolph-Macon College in Virginia, took a B.A., then an M.A., then he went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to study medicine. He met Mother's sister Edith at Hopkins. They used to fence for exercise. Mother and Dad met at Edith's apartment. When he met Mother, she was fascinated by him and took a teaching job there in Baltimore in order to snag him. She succeeded. They saw a lot of each other. Dad seemed to her to be very interested in her, but he didn't propose. She began to think he was just stringing her along. Finally, in desperation, she said, "You know, the great thing about our relationship is that whenever one of us marries, it won't hurt our relationship at all." Dad was indignant. "I don't know how you could say such a thing. If I don't marry you, I shall never marry anyone." Mother said, "May I take this as a proposal?" Dad said he'd been proposing to her for 6 months. She was too literal-minded. Where's your common sense? Dad was offered several very good jobs in New York hospitals, but he thought New York a poor place to live. Mother and Dad were married. They moved to Hartford. They wanted to have a big family. They were both dedicated to the bettering of the position of men and of women. At the beginning, Mother and Dad lived opposite the Hartford Hospital, where Dad was an intern, and then he was a resident. The residents were supposed to sleep in the hospital at the end of a bell. Well, Dad found a house just across from the hospital on Hudson Street, strung up his own bell system. He was very fast on his feet, and as he was never late, he was never found out. Time passed, and Mother was walking through the park one day, Tom, her first son, walking along by her side, and me, Kathy, being wheeled. Well, thought Mother, here I am, these 2 adorable children, handsome, brilliant husband, looking forward to his brilliant career. But me, what of me? What of me? Is this all I'm here for? There must be something. She went home sort of puzzled, and Daddy came rushing in and said, "Look here in the paper, a woman named Emmeline Pankhurst is speaking about women and the vote tonight." They went. Dad obviously had begun to realize that Mother was getting a bit restless about her spot in the world. He found the solution. Mother became the head of the Connecticut Woman Suffrage Association. Women, their problems, the vote, prostitution, the white slave traffic, teenage pregnancy, venereal disease, and huge public meetings. Mother had a booth at the Connecticut Fairgrounds, and we had a gas cylinder in the booth so that we could fill balloons. Votes for women, balloons, purple, white, and green. I was about 8. I used to fill the balloons, tie a 6-foot string onto them, go out into the street, pursue visitors to the fair, follow them until they were willing to accept one of my balloons, whether they wanted one or not. In what was a rather insistent voice, I said, "Vote for women, here, take it, vote for women," and they took it. Brought up in the midst of all this, Tom and I were used to being in parades. We were used to being, snubbed in the most subtle sense of the word. There were many people who violently disagreed with what Mother and Dad were aiming at. Gradually, the majority joined our side, and Mother was right, and Dad was right, of course, And naturally we were on the right side too, and it was all for the benefit of the helpless and the oppressed, the poor, of course. The things Mother and Dad fought for turned out in their favour. Our house at tea time was a meeting ground. We kids were allowed in, but we didn't do much talking, if any. We met Emmeline Pankhurst, Margaret Sanger, Rebecca West, Richard Bennett, any number of distinguished doctors and professors. The door of our house was always opened. My parents would say, come in, tell us about it. Come with us, spend the night. Oh, stay to lunch. No, there's plenty of room. Always. Mother and Dad were perfect parents. They brought us up with a feeling of freedom. There were no, rules. There were simply certain things which we did, and there were certain things which we did not do because they would hurt others. And I think to myself, how I miss you too. I was so used to turning to you. It was heaven, always to have you two to turn to in despair and joy. There you were, strong, funny, two rocks. What luck to be born out of love and to live in an atmosphere of warmth and interest. We were a big family. Dad and Mother had 6 children over a period of 15 years. Tom, Kath, Dick, Bob, Marion, Peg. We were a happy family. We are a happy family. As children, we were Tom and me, Dick and Bob, then Marion and Peg. I was much older than my sisters. To them, I was really another grown-up. They were 11 and 13 years younger than I am, almost like my own children. Bob and Dick were closer, but they were boys. When I went to college at 17, they were 11 and 13, so as kids, we really were not living as equals. It was my parents and me, and Tom, and then the kids, the children. As children, they used to visit me in New York. I felt as though they were mine. I'd dress them up. I'd take them to the theatre, to movies, museums, all the excitements. Mother used to tutor them when money became a bit scarce in the early 30s. She was a wonderful teacher, and the girls adored it, and her. I was a sort of rich aunt, and we had great fun together. I'm sure this was why I never had children of my own. What can I say? The luck of having Dad and Mother. They really loved each other. Dad with his red hair and his hot temper. Some say I'm like him. I hope so. I would be so proud. Mother with a real savvy of life. She adored him. She adored us. She was deep. She was witty. Some say I'm like her. I hope so. I'd be so proud. They loved reading aloud. Shaw, Emerson, O'Neill. They took what life had to offer and they gobbled it up. Some send off a real set of values and a sense of joy. So, I was born 80-odd years ago, May 12th, 1907, despite everything I may have said to the contrary. In Hartford, Connecticut, 22 Hudson Street, then opposite the Hartford Hospital. The street doesn't exist anymore. The hospital grew over it. Hartford is the capital of Connecticut. It is a charming city full of parks and hills and even elm trees. Some lovely old houses, good skating, skiing in winter, hot in summer. Very soon after my birth, we moved to 133 Hawthorne Street. Hawthorne Street had a fireplace with "Listen to the Song of Life" scrolled across the top. It was a lovely early Victorian house with 3 peaks, the center one a bit higher than the other 2. Red brick, painted, with a black lace trim. It doesn't exist anymore, either. It was next to the Arrow Electric factory, east of us. Ours was a long and fairly wide piece of land, with a stream running along the factory side at the bottom of a sort of little woodland of trees, mostly hemlock and pine. At the front of the property, the driveway was a big circle to the front door. The house was about 70 feet from the street. In the winter, when there was a heavy snow, we'd enclose that circle in a high wall of snow, very thick. Terrible battles would ensue. It was like a feudal town. The lawn was deep, and it ran back to the railroad track. To the east there was a gulch with a lot of trees so that we couldn't see the factory. a sort of woods full of daffodils, jack-in-the-pulpits, trillium. Oh, you see that hemlock tree on the west side of the property? That was the tree I used to climb. The neighbours used to call my mother, say, "Kit, Kathy is in the top of the hemlock." Yes, I know, don't scare her. She doesn't know that it's dangerous. There was another tree, an elm, which played a big part in our lives. It had a tall trunk and it went up straight without any branches. About 60 feet up there was a strong branch, almost parallel to the ground, growing straight out. To this branch, Dad tied a swinging ladder. We'd climb up this long wooden ladder to get to a trapeze, which was on a pulley, which was all set to ride a rope, which went from the elm to the very back of our long property. We'd climb up, we'd get onto the trapeze, sitting or hanging by our knees, and ride down the rope, which, of course, started high up and it went down to ground level. It was thrilling. Across the gravel path, down to our back door, across the back lawn to the end of the property. It used to terrify people. Dad was a very good athlete, and he wanted us to be. If we lived, said Mother. Mother, not being an athletic type, would suffer as she saw her daughter riding the trapeze over a gravel walk, hanging by her feet, high in the air, hanging by her heels. But she kept silent. She thought it looked fun. On Sundays and holidays we'd walk in the woods. We'd climb, we'd swing trees, climb up as high as we could, then, holding on as tight as possible, we'd swing our legs out, bend the treetop over to the ground. It was great fun. Because of Dad, we were the center of action, and because of Mother, we were always able to provide cookies and ginger ale or sarsaparilla or birch beer. But the greatest gift she gave us was freedom. Freedom to be noisy. Freedom to yell. No nags. Do it, yes, do it. Tell me about it. I went to the West Middle School when I was a kid, for public school, kindergarten, and then on up to 5th grade. I headed a group of kids who wanted Police Officer O'Malley left at the Farmington Avenue and Laurel Street crossroad. They had decided to move him to a different location. He was fun. We liked him. We petitioned and we won. O'Malley stayed with us. At the east end of Nile Street was Trinity Church. The daughter of the pastor was my great friend, Florence Miel. She was pretty. She had gorgeous curly brown hair, long. I was freckled, wore my hair like a boy's, shaved. In fact, with one brother, Tom, older, and my 2 youngers, Dick and Bob, being a girl was a torment. I always wanted to be a boy. Jimmy was my name, and if you want to know. I loved diving. Hell, I loved all sports. I was skinny and I was very strong and I was utterly fearless. There was a pier at Fenwick, our summer house, and a diving board on the pier. The height of the board from the water naturally varied with the tide. There was a railing on the pier about 2.5 or 3 feet high. In order to get a better spring, because I was quite skinny, I'd stand on the top of the railing, jump off it to the end of the board, and dive, either a jackknife, a swan dive, a 1.5, a somersault. Running off the end of the board, I would do a half gainer, standing on the end of the board, a backflip or a back dive. It was great fun. Golf became a sort of specialty with me and with my brother Bob. We went to Fenwick in the summer where we had a private 9-hole course, and as very young kids, we could play at any time. We began at, aged 5. When I was 12 or 13, Mother started me on lessons at the Hartford Golf Club when we were back in town, for the winter, from an Englishman named Jack State. Mother, who had never had any athletic training, struggled with golf and with swimming and with diving. She believed in teachers. The winter, I was 14 years old. I decided to tutor instead of going to Oxford school. I wanted to be able to play golf every day. Well, actually, I didn't want to be in any school. Too many girls, too much curiosity. I'll tell you why. My brother Tom was 2.5 years older than I, had just died under strange circumstances. I adored him. Actually, Tom's death has remained unexplained. It was Easter time, Kingswood, summer vacation, or spring vacation, I suppose you'd say. The boys' private school in Hartford was on holiday. Tom and I were to go to New York to visit Aunt Mary Toll. She had a charming house on Charlton Street in Greenwich Village. She'd been at Bryn Mawr College with Mother. They'd become great friends. Auntie was a lawyer, and the house next door on Charlton Street was occupied by Bertha Rembaugh. Bertha Rembaugh was a judge. They were nice, and they were very successful. Mary Toll never married. We called her Auntie, and she was generous and fun. When we visited her, she took us to plays and showed us the sights of the big city. This visit, we went to the theatre to see a play called Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. When we got home from the theatre, well, I can't really tell you what I did, but as I later told the story, I said that Tom had looked at me and said, "You're my girl, aren't you? You're my favorite girl in the whole world." Why did I say this? Was it true? I mean, did Tom really say it? I honestly don't know. At Auntie's, Tom used to sleep in a sort of studio attic at the top of the house. It was full of junk and trunks, and it had no ceiling, just roof and rafters. His bed was a cot next to a wall. The facts were as follows. Next morning I went upstairs to wake him up, and there he was, next to the bed, his knees bent, hanged by a torn piece of sheeting. It was tied to a rafter. He was dead. He was strangled. Made no sense. In a state of numb shock, I cut him down, and I laid him on the bed. Tom was dead. He was just plain dead. What should I do? Whom should I tell? Auntie was too emotional. She'd be frantic. "A doctor, get a doctor, get a doctor." I went downstairs. I shut the front door. I'd seen a doctor's sign on one of the houses across the street. I went to the door, rang the bell. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. The door was open, just a crack, by a woman peering out. "Yes?" "My brother's dead." A moment pause. "What?" she said. My brother, he's dead." "Then the doctor can't help him, can he?" "No," I answered. Bang! The door closed. She closed the door. She just closed that door. I stood for a moment. Yes, she's right. The doctor, it's too late for the doctor to help. I'd better go back. I rang the bell at Aunt Bertha's house. She answered. "Tom is dead," I said. Then I burst into tears. This was what I thought I should do. People die, you cry. But inside I was frozen. Aunt Bertha took over. She told Auntie. They called Mother and Dad. I just remember confusion then. We were on a boat crossing the Hudson with Tom's body, going to a crematorium in New Jersey. I can remember standing with Dad on the bow of that boat. I looked across at Mother. Mother was crying. My mother was crying. Oh, dear, what can I do? I've never seen my mother cry before, and I never saw her cry again. Never. She was stalwart. My father didn't cry either. He took what life had to offer. I only saw him once, what shall I say, thrown for a loop. It was one day in early 1951. Dad and I had gone to Fenwick. We'd driven to Fenwick, left Mother in Hartford to take her afternoon nap. We were getting back for tea at 5. We had tea every day at 5. When we got home, we walked into the living room. There was no fire in the fireplace. Mother's chair was empty. No fire. We rushed upstairs. We opened the bedroom door. Mother was there in bed, dead. I looked at Dad. "Oh, no. No," he said. "I can't. She can't." "Go down, Daddy. Don't look. Go down, Daddy," I said. Mother had had her nap every day. This was a must. She was getting dressed for tea. She must have felt something queer. She went from her dressing room into the bedroom, got into bed, and with her left hand was pulling up the covers, and bingo, dead. I stood. My mother, dead. My darling mother, the only mother I'll ever have. gone. I took her hand, still warm, unclasped her fingers from the sheet she'd pulled up, and I kissed her. And I went out to Dad. No goodbyes, just gone. After Tom's death, she went to Cedar Hill Cemetery when we buried his ashes, but afterwards she never mentioned him. She never said, "I'm going to the cemetery." Neither did Dad. They moved on into life. At first the newspapers said Tom had committed suicide. There was no reason for him to commit suicide that anyone could see. Then Dad made a statement that it was very possible that Tom was practicing hanging himself. Dad told us about this trick of pretending to hang as a kid in football games or baseball. The teams that came from the North were very aware of the Southern attitude toward the Negro and felt that the Virginians, Dad was a Virginian, were cruel and felt superior to the blacks. As a means of irritating these Northerners, the Virginians trained several blacks to pretend that they were being hanged. Dad was an expert at this. It was holding his neck in a certain position, a trick that prevented the noose from cutting off his wind. Dangerous sport. Could it be that Tom was practicing this and using sheeting instead of rope? The noose was slippery, and he could not control it. Could that have been the case? Dad felt this was a reasonable possibility, and how this must have tortured Dad, but we never talked about it. It's amazing how Dad's and Mother's behavior left its mark. They simply did not believe in moaning about anything. The important thing was that Tom was dead. In the first terrible shock, Mother cried, but she never allowed the fact of his death to dominate the atmosphere. We were not a sad household. Anyway, this incident seemed to sort of separate me from the world as I'd known it. I'd tried school, but I felt isolated. I knew something that the girls did not know. I knew tragedy. They were curious, and I would not. I did not want to talk about it or discuss it. The school year ended at the end of May. I never returned to school. In the fall, I decided to tutor. My tutoring years were very pleasant. Being more or less alone did not bother me. We had a seamstress, Mary Ryan, who used to come every Thursday. I used to talk to her. She was Irish. She was very nice. Then I had a little theatre which I'd made out of a wooden box. It had a floor with lines cut in it. Every half inch it was green, the floor parallel to the front. I could stand the scenery, the cardboard scenery, and the actors in the cracks, and I'd make up the stories. I also had a curtain which I could open and close, and I'd give shows to my brothers Dick and Bob, and they seemed to like it. Dad used to take us to the movies every Saturday night. There were 3 theatres in Hartford that we could visit, the Strand, the Majestic, and the Empire. The Empire ran westerns, and it was easy to park the car. Silent movies, Tom Mix, William S. Hart, the Western heroes. I adored movies, I still do. Mother and Dad used to go to any good play which came to Parsons Theatre, and if we wanted to go, they'd get us matinee seats. I used to bribe Dick and Bob to go to the corner drugstore to buy me movie magazines. That's what I found fascinating. At the same time, they'd buy themselves and me ice cream sundaes covered with chocolate sauce and marshmallow and chocolate shot. These were called chocolate imperials. The money for these delights I used to earn in the winter by shoveling snow in our driveway and various sidewalks in the neighborhood, cutting lawns, leaf raking in the fall. The house at 133 Hawthorne, which Mother and Dad had occupied from early on, was to be torn down, and the Arrow Electric Company, the factory, who owned it, were going to extend their buildings to fill our 133 property. Dad, with 4 children and another on the way, could not wait to find a place. He found 352 Laurel Street, not anywhere as nice as 133 Hawthorne, but the best available at that time. Mother had adored 133 Hawthorne, the house, the property. It had real charm and distinction. She'd been heartbroken at the thought of 352 Laurel. I thought Mother was right. 133 was unique, it was beautiful, and 352 was really nothing much. Poor Mother, she never forgot it. And I remember thinking, when you have a choice like that, you must be very careful not to just go down a road because you'd planned to. If you have a choice, be careful only to be influenced by what is best in the long run. We were not rich, and Dad was thinking of the wasted money. Our house on 133 Hawthorne is gone. Victorian Gothic, 3 cables, trimmed with black lace. The driveway, the trees, gracious, simple, the brook, the daffodils, gone. Even the brook has been put into a pipe. Well, that's the style today. Pipe things, can things, freeze things, computerize things. Have to be careful about that. You can't develop a mind full of beauty or tender imagination and independence of spirit tearing along in a box without a bit of space and without a bit of air. Connecticut is home to me. I've been stuck in the snow. I've lost a house in a hurricane. I've tennised. I've golfed. It's been fun. I've lived there, and I'm going to be buried there. I was married to Ludlow Ogden Smith there on December 12th, 1928. My grandfather Hepburn, who was minister, officiated. Dad and Mother died there. Mother in 1951, Daddy in 1962. Santa, Dad's second wife, Madeline Santa Croce, was lonely in such a big house alone, and she moved into her sister's apartment. Dad was really the last inhabitant of the Hartford house. In 1960, 61, 62, Daddy began to feel rottenly. I remember having a long conversation with my brother Bob on the telephone about him. I was on the West Coast with Spencer at this time, so that I wasn't really up on Dad's situation. Dad would never complain about how he felt. He simply would not say that he was suffering. Actually, Bob said that he must have been in a terrible state. They discovered that he had a burst gallbladder. It had been full of stones, and of course his abdomen was full of stones, and of bile too, hard as a rock. He was simply gradually being poisoned. Bob said the pain must have been really excruciating. Not a word out of Daddy, not a word. He found moaning about one's health totally disgusting. He was operated on by Dr. Wells Standish. His blood pressure went down, down, down too far, and finally affected his ability to think and to talk. Then he had to have a prostate operation. My brother did that operation. Wasn't customary to operate on a close relative, but Bob thought he could do it best, as it was his specialty. So he did it. Bob said Dad at this time acted really as though he were quietly studying his own demise. Never a word, never a complaint. He just endured, or he'd catch Bob's eye and he'd smile or wink at him. I got back to Hartford for a little visit. Daddy had moved down onto the first floor to the study, which luckily had a bathroom off it. He seemed happy as always, but much weaker. One morning, Bobby and I were eating breakfast in the dining room across the hall. We went in to see how Daddy was, and he seemed to be quietly leaving the world. He smiled, he looked at us, and he slowly stopped breathing. His chin fell. He closed his eyes. He was gone, just gone. Bob and I sat there. Such a remarkable man Dad had been, so strong, so definite, so tough, and funny. He'll never be forgotten. Such a powerhouse coming to the end of the trail. He wrote his own rules. He followed them to the smallest detail. Row your own boat. What wonderful examples, our parents. My, we were so lucky. Like my mother, I went to Bryn Mawr College. I was in the class of 1928. My first year, I lived in a suite. Room and a bedroom, ground floor, first door on the right, Pembroke West. There was also a Pembroke East, and between the two Pembrokes there was a gate, and over it was a huge dining room. Having not been in school for several years, I was really not at home, and I was certainly not at ease with a lot of strange girls. I used to go to bed very early. Then I'd get up at 4:30 a.m., go down the hall to the bathroom and have solitude. Hot, cold shower, John. I used to eat fruit and cereal and milk for breakfast so that I could have that alone in my room and avoid too many girls. Actually, I finally avoided the dining room altogether. In the early part of the semester, I'd gone into the dining room. I started for the Pembroke West table. I was dressed, I can remember it perfectly, I was dressed in a French blue flared skirt which buttoned up the front with big white buttons and an Iceland blue and white sweater, which was popular at the time. I was painfully self-conscious, and to my horror I heard a voice, a New York voice, from the vicinity of where I was supposed to sit. Self-conscious beauty? I nearly dropped dead. God knows I didn't discover myself a beauty. Oh dear, no. I continued into the room. I ate the food, and that year I never went back into that dining room. My second year, I resumed with a girl I'd gotten to know, so it wasn't so bad. Anyway, I'd gotten used to the girls, and I suppose they'd gotten used to me. I belonged to a particular group, easy to function with the protection of a few others. These have more or less remained my friends, especially the ones living in New York or Connecticut. My last 3 years at Bryn Mawr were nowhere near as traumatic as that first one. I wasn't a member of any club then, but I acted in several plays, which was fun. I played the leading man in one play, The Truth About Blades, by A.A. Milne. I played the juvenile. I had to wear a wig covering my long hair and a pair of pants which were a bit tight in the seat. I can remember one frightful moment when we were giving a performance of it at the Colony Club in New York. Somehow or other I managed to put my hand into the pants pocket, and then I sat down. Well, after a bit I tried to get my hand out of the pants pocket, and it was impossible. I tried several times. I got a bit confused and kept yanking. This turned out to be a splendid laugh. Before my senior year ended, I'd made friends with a man named Jack Clark who lived in a house next door to the college campus. His best friend was Ludlow Ogden Smith. Jack had several friends in the theatre, and he happened to know Edwin Knopf, who ran a theatre company, a very good one, with big stars in Baltimore. I got him to give me a letter to Knopf, and one weekend my friend Libret and I drove over to Baltimore. My mother's sister, Edith Houghton Hooker, lived there. I went to see Edwin Knopf, and he said, "Well, write me a note when you finish college." I finished college. Dad always said if you want to get something, don't write, don't telephone, be there yourself in person, harder to turn down a living presence. I thought, no, I'll appear myself. So I did. I went to see Eddie Knopf. I found my way in from the front. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a stage door. I heard voices. It sounded like a rehearsal. I opened a door so that I could see the stage. It was a rehearsal. I crept in and I sat in the back row of the theatre like a mouse. An hour passed. Then, to my horror, I needed to go to the bathroom. Well, finally, I had to go to the bathroom. The whole theatre, away from the stage area, was as black as pitch. I felt my way around the lobby, down a stairway into another lobby, and finally a John. Then I found my way out, and I went back to my spot. Another hour, and then a third hour, and then all of a sudden it was over and they were finishing. The lights in the auditorium came on. Eddie Knopf saw me. He walked up the aisle. He stopped by me and said, "Oh, you, yes, report for rehearsal, Monday, 11 o'clock. And he was gone. My God, I had a job. He knew me. He gave me a job. That Monday I walked into his office at 10:45. "I'm here for rehearsal." "You're in the wrong place." It was thus that I learned that there was a stage door. I went in. It was quite a large group. The play was to be the Tsarina, Mary Boland starring as the Tsarina. The parts were handed round. There were a number of young girls besides myself. I had noticed that I had the biggest part. We were all introduced to one another. Then we sat around a big table and we read the play. Thrilling. My part was really very nice. Wasn't I lucky? The rehearsals were many and long. It was announced that the costumes would be assigned one morning at 11. Well, I thought, I'm going to get there early, and I got there at 10. I was not the first to arrive. I was the last. Well, that was a big shock. I wasn't as clever as I thought. And, of course, I got the worst costume, inches too short, not very becoming at the neck. And then something very strange happened. One of the girls came up to me and said, I was the first here, and I want you to take my costume. It's the prettiest. I was struck dumb. I'd hardly spoken to the girl. I looked at her. She had the dress on. It was lovely. Oh, but no, I couldn't. She stopped me. I'm going to be married, she said. I'm not going to be an actor, and I think that you are going to be. I think you are going to be a big star, and I want you to have my costume. Can you imagine anyone being that generous? Wasn't I lucky? I got the best dress by far, and I don't even remember her name. The play was about to open. I was totally ignorant of the ways of the theatre, had no makeup, used no makeup except lipstick. Christie's No. 2, bright red orange. Mary Boland told me what makeup to get. How to do eyes. I watched her makeup. She was so generous, gave me all sorts of bits and pieces. They were all very nice to me, the stars of that company. The play opened. I got 2 very nice notices in my little part. I was known a bit socially in Baltimore. Well, I hope that wasn't the reason that I was noticed, but for whatever reason the printed word said I was arresting, and I was given a part next week's show, The Torchbearers. This was another play which Mary Boland had done. There was a part for me, not a very good one. I knew I was not very good in it. When I got nervous, my voice would shoot up into the top of my head. Well, I didn't really know how to control it, know what the hell I was doing anyway. I talked to Kenneth McKenna. He suggested, when I left the company, that I should go to New York and study voice with a woman named Frances Robinson Duff. Ina Claire was one of her pupils, so was he. Duff was very well known. She's the best voice teacher in New York, Kenneth said. Well, why wait? I thought, hell, I'll drop this and I'll go to New York. I looked her up. I found out how much she charged. My father had been disgusted and heartsick over the fact that I wanted to act. He thought it was a silly profession, closely allied to street walking, that I developed into a cheap show-off, and that I was entering a shabby profession which was based on youth and looks, definitely a foundation of sand for a silly life. He wasn't about to be the financial back of such a project. My mother was all for it, anything. I wanted anything, just so that I didn't settle for the old routine of nursemaid to the rising generation. She thought women should give life a whirl, see if they could swing it so they could be more independent of the male sex. Daddy was for this, too. He just didn't care for the road I'd chosen. But I had saved up some allowance money when I went to Baltimore. I had over $250. That was a lot to me, but it wasn't enough for Frances Robinson Duff. So I wrote Dad a letter, which I thought would sell him the importance of training for the job I'd chosen. Would he back me? He'd already sent me $50, which he said he'd won on a golf match or a bridge game, gambling money, not real money. So he was sending it on to me. After that, of course, I knew that with a small push he'd be on my side. We were very close, Daddy and Mother and I. None of us liked the separate ways, so of course he told me yes, he'd pay for Duff. And so I left Baltimore and away I went to New York City after the second week in Baltimore. Frances Robinson Duff was an experience. She had a house on East 62nd Street between 2nd and 3rd. She and her mother had been an opera singer. She taught opera. Frances was tall. She was about 5'7". She was stout. She had a big stomach, and she had a medium-sized bosom, and she was very corseted. Her office was on the top floor. She tried to teach me how to speak from my diaphragm. I would have to put my hand on her diaphragm, hold it there, my hand, as she pursed her lips to blow out a candle. Well, it was a strange feeling. I had my hand on the top of a corset, and it was somehow extremely embarrassing to me. I don't think But at that time, I really got the notion of producing air from the diaphragm rather than straining the throat. Now, I can call, hey, straight from the diaphragm, but my lack of success with really connecting my voice and the volume to the diaphragm caused me great worries in my career. I kept losing my voice. I'd get very hoarse whenever I played a part which was fast and loud. It was an agony. In a way, I can understand why I couldn't connect voice and diaphragm. Well, I think I was so excited by life and living in my future that I was simply wound up so tight I couldn't relax. So I was in the big city, New York, studying with Francis Robinson Duff. I didn't know the city at all, really, neither would you. I had the use of Luddy's car in New York. You could park almost anywhere in those days. It was totally unlike New York today. There was no FDR Drive, no West Side Highway, no George Washington Bridge. The Holland Tunnel was just about ready, the Lincoln not yet existing. In my area, the East 40s and earlier, East 39th Street, there were elevateds on 3rd Avenue, elevateds on 2nd. I'm talking about 20s and early 30s. Central Park was open to cars. I used to drive up there and park, spend the day. Very few people used the park then. There was no running. There was no Pan-American building ruining the view of the silhouette of Grand Central against the sky. I moved into a big, empty family apartment of a college friend of mine, Megs Merrill, at 925 Park Avenue. My days were really spent hoping that the telephone would ring, offer me a job. I didn't really know anyone well in the big city. Jack Clark and his two sisters, Aggie and Louise Clark, were there. They were from Bryn Mawr, the town, not the college. Their friend, Ludlow Ogden Smith, they had apartments on 39th Street east of 3rd, and they were all nice to me, especially Luddy, with his generosity about the car. Jack Clark was tall, skinny, fascinating-looking, about 30. So was Luddy, about 30, I mean. I was 20. Luddy was tall, medium weight, and dark. He was an odd-looking man, dark hair, dark eyes, far apart, pink cheeks, an odd nose. It was a long nose with a hump in it, a long mouthful. Well, I'm trying to describe him, but this description sounds ridiculous. He didn't look ridiculous, I can assure you of that. Luddy and Jack were really good friends. They both had money, not a great deal, but enough so that life was easy. Jack and Luddy were looking for trouble, but as far as they got was taking naked pictures, photographs mainly of me, lying on a big sofa, which they had in the living room. I posed with total confidence, as I think I must have rather fancied myself. I can't remember who else posed. They gave me blow-ups of the picture. I remember I put them in a straw basket with a straw cover, and it had a strap around it, and I had it for years. I can't remember when it disappeared. I think I must have thought to myself, if I don't look at them, they don't exist. Odd. Now, I still think that if I don't look at something, it doesn't exist. I never look at notices. They don't exist. Or at movies that I've made that don't exist. My past sins, so to speak, they don't exist. But I was telling you about Luddy because it was really his generosity which sent me on my way. He was the soul of sensitivity. Luddy came from Stratford, Pennsylvania, which was several stations beyond Bryn Mawr on the main line. He'd gone to Grenoble to college in France. He was a fine musician, and he could pick up any language in a few days. He could function wherever. As I mentioned, Jack Clark and his sisters were then living in New York. Luddy was living nearby. I began to see them for dinner and the movies and whatever. Luddy had a car. He used to drive me to Fenwick for the weekends, and soon we saw more and more and more and more of each other. What did you say? Where did it happen? Oh, yes, of course. It was in the Clarks' apartment. They were all away, and, well, I guess that I knew that Luddy was in love with me, but you see, my hitch was that I was in love with myself. I mean, you know, I wanted to be a big star. Anyway, Luddy and I were alone in the apartment, and there was the bed, and there didn't seem to be any reason not to. Well, what I'm trying to say is that that's what happened. I mean, we did it. I mean, I guess the laddie knew what he was doing, and I didn't object, so we did it, and that was the end of my virtue. He was my beau from then on. Listen, let me tell you, yes, he was my beau, and that's the biggest but you ever heard. He was my friend. He was really my friend. Well, my first job, the Knopf Stock Company, had suddenly decided to try a New York production with Kenneth McKenna of The Big Pond, a play which they had tried out with some success in Baltimore. They'd sent for me to be the understudy to the leading lady. Naturally, I was thrilled. I learned the part. I sat on the sidelines, quite convinced that I would be far superior to the leading lady I was watching, Lucille Nicholas. She was a very competent actress who did not have the advantage of being very young and absolutely outrageous and full of a sort of wild confidence based on nothing but energy and ego. Of course, I thought I was scared to death, but all I could say now is, looking back, I was not scared enough. Open a door, I'd go through, even if the room I was entering was on fire. One lunch hour after the play had been in rehearsal a week, they asked me to stay and play a scene. Pushed by a sort of frenetic boiling over, I must have read it very well. They fired the leading lady and they took me. I didn't, of course, know what I was doing, but I did it with great style. I took this change in my status as a matter of course. I was a leading lady, yes. I'd been in the theatre 4 weeks. This was happening just as I imagined it would. It should. I was arriving. Then a whirlwind of memories begged off Goodman for the clothes, the shoes, lots of flattery, the trip to Great Neck for a Saturday night performance. This was a very popular place to play a one-night stand. I drove out in my car. I arrived at the Great Neck Theatre at about 6 o'clock for the opening. Thought, well, don't go in, too terrifying. Stay away as long as possible. I could make up in 5 minutes. My hair was never a problem. Pretend it's not happening. Get in about 10 after 8. So I fiddled around. I ate my dinner, which I brought with me in a field, took a run, finally turned up at the theatre at 10 after 8, to the fury of everyone. But I got made up, I got dressed, I rushed on at my cue. Very quickly after my entrance, I had to do an imitation of Kenneth McKenna, who was playing a Frenchman, who was to be my guide in the play. My mother and father and I were touring Europe, supposedly. I had a good French accent. It brought down the house. They burst into applause. Well, naturally, I thought, well, that's that. I'm a star. Overconfidence flooded in. My voice went up. My tempo increased, and apparently to everyone but myself, I became very difficult to understand. Too high, too fast. I wasn't McKenna's leading lady. I was the star. He was my leading man. The play over, I noticed that no one was particularly bothered to come in and tell me that I was remarkable, but as I'd never really been a big star of an opening night, I didn't know what to expect. So I thought, well, they must have problems. It never occurred to me that I was the problem. Next morning, I was about to leave for rehearsal when Frances Robinson Deaf called, told me to come to her house before I went to work. I said, I'll be late, Frances. She said, they won't mind. On my way to her, I thought, they won't mind? What does that mean? I got to her house. She sent for me. I climbed up to her studio, went in, and the minute I saw her long and very serious face, I've been fired, I said. Yes, she said. Well, at a loss for words. I'm not crying. Aren't you proud of me? No, she said, I'd be prouder if you were. That was the trouble with your performance last night, too self-contained. Well, fired, I said. Oh, dear, how embarrassing. Well, they must feel dreadfully. Who's going to play my part? The one who was, she answered, Lucille Nicholas. Oh, yes, I answered. Well, she must be very happy. That's nice, isn't it? Now, I think I'll just run down there to the National so that they can see that I'm not too upset. And I was off. Down to the theatre I went, burst in on them, congratulated the leading lady. They offered me back my understudy job, and I said, no, thank you. I thought that would be unwise. I thanked them all, and I left. What must they have thought? Then I took the train to Hartford, told my family they decided that they would never again miss one of my opening nights. That might be my only performance, and we all laughed merrily. Ha, 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 ha. Onward. Back to New York I went. The next day I received 2 calls, one from Arthur Hopkins and one from J.J. Schubert. I went first to Schubert. He'd seen my performance in the big pond. You were sweet, my dear, he said. There were women, men, gentlemen, riffraff, whores, ladies and children in that audience on Saturday night. They liked you, all of them. Yes, I said, everyone but the management. They were fools to let you go. I'm offering you a 5-year deal beginning at $250 and ending at $1,500. Yearly options. I thought quickly, don't buy a pig in a poke. Well, that's very reassuring, Mr. Schubert, but I don't think that I would like to be tied up to anyone so that I couldn't do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. Think it over. Don't be a fool, Katharine. Yes, I will, sir, and out I went. He couldn't believe it. I walked through Schubert Alley, down 45th Street to Arthur Hopkins' office, found the stairway, the back of the orchestra at the Plymouth Theatre, walked up. I came to his door. It was a small office. His secretary, Miss Hess, on the left, and his own tiny office on the right. Miss Hess told me to go in. I heard her telephone him, so I went to the door, and I stood there. He was at his desk facing me, reading a script. Finally, he looked up. Hello, dear. I saw you the other night. He smiled. You were good. I'd like to have you work for me. Thank you, sir, I said. I'd like to. He looked back at his script. I stood there. Minutes passed. Well, I thought then, what am I supposed to do? That's that. He'd like to have me work for him, so I'd better get out. He seems to want to read, so I started to leave, and his voice called me back. Don't you want to know what you're going to do? Yes, sir. He reached for a script at the end of his desk. Read this. The part of Veronica. We go into rehearsal next week, Monday, 11 o'clock. I left. I had a job. The play was These Days by Katharine Clugston. My part was a schoolgirl, a nice part. We rehearsed in New York at the Plymouth Theatre. Hopkins had his own way of rehearsing. You'd sit around a big table and you'd read the play, and you'd read it over and over and over and over again until everyone knew it and felt that the play itself was thoroughly understood. Then in no time, on one's feet, the whole thing slid into place. This seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, a very sensible way of doing, jumping up immediately with a script in one's hand and wandering about before you know the part. I never could understand that. I'd do it, but I learned the play first. I suppose I was exposed to Hopkins' method early on, and it made sense. So if I know the play before I rehearse, I'm in a better position to feel where I'd like to be to play a scene, and in a better position to argue with the director. Having also studied the play very hard, so many actors say, oh, but I couldn't learn it until I know where I'm going. I never could see the sense in that. It's like saying you don't want to learn to walk until you know where you're going. Being one track, I have to learn it. Then my instinct tells me where to go, or the director does. Well, it doesn't really matter, standing, sitting, just so the audience hears it.